The vast majority of people know almost nothing about the historical phenomenon known as alchemy. Perhaps the only thing that the average person could bring to mind about alchemy would be the often repeated fact that, the alchemists, weren't they trying to turn lead into gold? But even that statement, which does verge upon the truth, when you repeat it without context and without understanding what alchemy even is, it becomes a falsehood. It becomes oversimplified to the point of being wrong. The kind of so-called alchemist who went around to kingly courts, promising them that he could turn lesser metals into more valuable metals by way of magical processes that no one else understood. That kind of person could be more helpfully classed among the ranks of charlatans and con artists and flim-flam men, but it's not descriptive of what the real alchemists were up to. Upon any serious attempt to comprehend the alchemists, you quickly find that that kind of flippant dismissal of the alchemical project is just ignorant. It's a refusal to take seriously a tradition of 2,000 years of spirituality and scientific inquiry that spanned multiple civilizations, and that was massively impactful, culturally impactful, on Western civilization. And so that's sort of the first roadblock you encounter in talking about alchemy. Is just the people who say, oh, it's just pseudoscience. There's also a somewhat less common, but a little bit more informed view of alchemy that does exist in the zeitgeist, that I think is still flawed and incomplete. But more and more people are coming around to this, saying that, for all its superstitious baggage, alchemy was at least a necessary step in the direction of modern chemistry. And many of you will know the many achievements in science that alchemy has brought us. And here I do mean hard science in the narrow, modern sense that we would use the term science. Innovations in metallurgy, in making dyes and perfumes and other useful substances. The innovations that led to the modern process of distilling for making alcohol, right? And of course, great scientific minds, such as Isaac Newton, studied and practiced alchemy. And that wasn't because Newton, the inventor of calculus, was a pseudoscientist and a kook. The modern discipline of chemistry simply didn't exist yet as a strictly empirical discipline, separated from any religious presuppositions about reality. And we could say the same thing about the psychology of that era, of the Middle Ages, or the physiology of the Middle Ages, or and the way in which astronomy emerges first in this sort of inseparable relationship with astrology. And it's only later that we gain the perspective that we could separate our calculations about the movements of the stars from claims about the meaning of those movements. And so, too, would be the way that this sort of approach to alchemy goes. The study of how material substances interact and transform, that emerged inseparably from a religious view of the world, a view that treated the world of matter as a reflection of the world of spirit in some way. And we could say, from our modern perspective, it is surely an advancement. It is a refinement to set spirit aside and train the scientific eye solely to focus on the world of matter. But the very quest to unravel the riddles of the material world, that can be attributed, at least in part, to a pseudo-religious discipline, and that is alchemy. That's where it all begins. But even that more charitable interpretation of alchemy, I think, misses a great deal, especially in the view of psychologist Carl Jung. In his own opus on the work of the alchemists, in the introduction, Jung outlines, in the most general possible terms, his thesis involving the significance of alchemy, which attributes far more importance to its spiritual dimension, we'll say, but from Jung's perspective, its psychological dimension. Jung writes, quote, "Until quite recently, science was interested only in the part that alchemy played in the history of chemistry, concerning itself very little with the part it played in the history of philosophy and religion. The importance of alchemy for the historical development of chemistry is obvious, but its cultural importance is still so little known that it seems almost impossible to say in a few words wherein that consisted. The point is that alchemy is rather like an undercurrent to the Christianity that ruled on the surface. It is to this surface as the dream is to consciousness. And just as the dream compensates the conflicts of the conscious mind, so alchemy endeavors to fill in the gaps left open by the Christian tension of opposites." End quote. A very evocative metaphor. Alchemy is the dream of the conscious life of Christianity, because Christianity ruled the conscious life of European civilization for millennia. And as Jung has always been keen to point out, the Christian accounting of things, of the psyche, of man's position in the world, at least the dogmatic Christian perspective, the way it is generally and conventionally understood, is imperfect in many ways. And those imperfections have to be compensated for by the unconscious. So one example of an imperfection from the point of view of psychoanalysis, which we will discuss in a bit more detail later on, concerns Christ as the symbol of the self. So Christ is the symbol of the self because he unifies matter and spirit, and he unifies God and man. But he does not unify, for example, good and evil. He's a purely righteous figure. I mean, people could point to incidents like Christ fashioning a scourge and going and brandishing it at all the money changers and flipping over their tables, and sort of suggest that that might represent some sort of unification of one's shadow, as Jung called it, the impulses that are not normally acceptable to express, right? But the problem is, within Christian dogma, everything Christ does becomes righteous by definition. So if Christ was angry, then it must have been righteous anger. And there's a refusal to see any sort of flaw or sinfulness within the image of Christ. In fact, the entire point is that Christ was a perfect human being, and perfection in the Christian dogmatic worldview means sinlessness. And further, Christ is a purely masculine image. Jung was very concerned with this, with the exclusion of the feminine from the Holy Trinity. And Jung thought that the assumption of the Virgin Mary would, at least for Catholics, help to provide a balance or a compensation by which the feminine could be considered truly divine once again, which is something that the pagans, for all of their flaws from the Jungian perspective, at least got right. They didn't have this imbalance in their image of the divine. They had male gods, they had female goddesses, and sometimes actually the imbalance went the other way. We could look at the Roman trinity of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. Well, in that case, we actually have two feminine images of the divine and only one male image. And of course, there was just an immense importance in Rome to, for example, the Vestal Virgins, goddesses such as Venus and Artemis. And so that sort of element of the divine feminine was not missing in the imagery and the spiritual life of the pagan world in the way that it seems to have a pronounced absence in the Christian world. Other than the Virgin Mary, this female image of the divine has been missing in the West, just as Christ is also missing his shadow. And so how does the Christian deal with the quote-unquote evil that he finds within himself? How does the example of Christ offer him a way forward in integrating his shadow? On the one hand, the Christian, he has a framework to see evil as the result of sin, which entered the world upon the fall of man, to see God or the Spirit as that force of grace makes it possible for him to resist sin. But this attitude doesn't really integrate these elements. So the dogmatic Christian can't really look at their own flaws and accept them. They can't say, that's who I am, at least so long as those flaws are sins. And so from a psychological perspective, we would say that such a one would feel their shadow to be absolutely a part of who they are, because it is. But they would also find their shadow to be completely unacceptable according to the laws of their religion. And so it's easy to get into this mindset of attempting to, cast off your sin in some way. And it ends up being this psychological mechanism of externalization. And thus in Europe, the importance of the devil as this influence of evil on human souls becomes very important in the Middle Ages. And, arguably, you could, just to steelman the case for true Christianity, so-called, whatever that might be, we might say a true imitator of Christ, that would not be the case for them. They would take the sin of the whole world onto themselves, as Christ did. And Jung believed most Christians did not really imitate Christ in this way, that the rigidity of the church in promoting the idea that the way to follow the religion is to memorize verses and follow the rules, that doesn't really provide Christian civilization with a way to integrate their unacceptable impulses. And likewise, the image of the Virgin Mary doesn't really make up for the exclusion of the feminine from the divine. Again, we have this one figure who is very important, but ultimately she's not really divine. She's just sort of a human who was chosen to become part of the divine family in a way. She's not that active creative force that God is with his power of the Logos and so on and so forth. So in any case, in Jung's view, the compensation for the incompleteness of Christianity, which rules the conscious European mind, the compensation for this emerges in alchemy. And alchemy is the perfect discipline for these psychological compensations. Because where the doctrines of Christianity are preached universally and publicly, they're proselytized openly, alchemy was a secretive practice. The alchemists said, perhaps with their tongue planted firmly in their cheek, that their method was to explain, quote, obscurum per obscurius, ignotum per ignotius, end quote, which means explain the obscure by the more obscure, explain the unknown by the more unknown. One of the things that certainly does not help with the public comprehension of alchemy in the modern day is that if you were to pick up pretty much any alchemical text from almost any era of its practice, you wouldn't be able to make heads or tails of it. Because the alchemists, for one, they intentionally attempted to hide their discoveries, and they cloaked what they were speaking about in religious allegories and symbolism. They used code and abbreviations, and they deliberately left things out that they felt their intended audience, which was other alchemists, would already know, so as not to unnecessarily disclose information to the uninitiated. This is anathema to modern science, and so it may make the modern mind suspicious, but I think we can better understand this attitude if we place ourselves into the mindsets of a scientific thinker from an earlier period. Place yourself before the Enlightenment and before the ethos of open communication between scientific minds, the idea that this will produce the best results, which does seem to be true. One only really adopts that ethos if they begin to identify their project with something that we might call by the name like progress, or we could extend that to mean more precisely progress for all humanity, right? Well, we only really get that idea as part of the Enlightenment, and even though it takes hundreds of years, it certainly is one of the factors directly leading to the death of alchemy, the end of secrecy as a method of scientific knowledge. But, even take your mindset, forget alchemy, take your mindset back to Venice at the period where, it's a prosperous and powerful city-state in the Renaissance, engaged in global trade, in staunch competition with other Italian cities. And everyone wants to know how to make Venetian glass. The secret of how they make it is closely guarded, and of course it would be. And we could say the same of the process for making Japanese steel or Damascus steel. I mean, you could approach a metallurgist from Damascus back in the day and suggest to him that sharing his knowledge of how to make Damascus steel would be good for the progress of all mankind, and he might laugh at you and say, I'm not concerned with the progress of all human knowledge. I'm concerned with Damascus, or I'm concerned with the power of Islamic civilization, whatever the case may be. So why would I want to give this knowledge to people who are my enemies? And it is worth noting also that this still happens today to some extent. I mean, we might think of the era of nuclear secrets during the Cold War, and the U.S. government does have the power to classify scientific discoveries as state secrets. And there are still scientific discoveries that are classified as state secrets under U.S. law. And so that is an affront to Enlightenment sensibilities. We might ask, who are you to say that you own knowledge? But there it is, so long as one has the power to do so, yes, they can own knowledge. This explains, at least in part, the secretive nature of alchemy. For the entirety of its almost 2,000 years of existence, it was secretive. But the other reason for keeping alchemical knowledge secret is not a material concern or political concern or something like that, but a spiritual concern, which is to say the alchemists believed that their scientific discoveries came to them by the grace of God. Now, certainly they wouldn't have discounted the fact that their own efforts, their own work had something to do with it, because he who does not sow shall not reap, as it is said. But the force that makes the crops grow from the soil in the Christian worldview, in the old Christian worldview, is God. God has a hand in this. And so the alchemists felt that God had to have a hand in making their work fruitful. And if that was the case, if God had seen fit to reveal some secret about the nature of matter to them, They had a responsibility to make certain that no heathen or impious man or apostate got their hands on such knowledge, people who wouldn't be able to understand it or who would sully that knowledge in some way. And so Jung writes in the section, The Psychic Nature of the Work, and this is a long chunk I'm going to read. I'm going to read from it in an abridged form because there's quite a lot here I'd like to parse through. But Jung writes, quote, "In alchemy there are two, in our eyes, heterogeneous currents flowing side by side, which we simply cannot conceive as being compatible. Alchemy's, quote, tam ethicae quam physicae, as much ethical, i.e. psychological, as physical, is impenetrable to our logic. If the alchemist is, admittedly, using the chemical process only symbolically, then why does he work in a laboratory with crucibles and alembics? And if, as he constantly asserts, he is describing chemical processes, why distort them past recognition with his mythological symbolisms? This puzzle has proved something of a headache to many an honest and well-meaning student of alchemy. On the one hand, the alchemist declares that he is concealing the truth intentionally, so as to prevent wicked or stupid people from gaining possession of the gold and thus precipitating a catastrophe. But, on the other hand, the same author will assure us that the gold he is seeking is not, as the stupid suppose, the ordinary gold, aurum vulgi. It is the philosophical gold, or even the marvelous stone, the lapis invisibilitatis, the stone of invisibility, or the lapis aetheris, the ethereal stone, or finally the unimaginable hermaphroditic rebus. And he will end up by saying that all recipes whatsoever are to be despised. Mystification can be pure bluff for the obvious purpose of exploiting the credulous, but any attempt to explain alchemy as a whole from this angle is, in my opinion, contradicted by the fact that a fair number of detailed, scholarly, and conscientious treatises were written and published anonymously, and therefore could not be of unlawful advantage to anyone. But mystification can arise from another source. The real mystery does not behave mysteriously or secretively. It speaks a secret language. It adumbrates itself by a variety of images which all indicate its true nature. The real nature of matter was unknown to the alchemist. He knew it only in hints. In seeking to explore it, he projected the unconscious into the darkness of matter in order to illuminate it. In order to explain the mystery of matter, he projected yet another mystery, his own unknown psychic background, into what would be explained." End quote. And so the alchemists claimed that they cloaked their knowledge in secrecy so that only the wise, only those who devoted their lives to a study of the alchemical work would be able to access their knowledge. But Jung's allegation is that in truth, the subject is so mystified on account of the fact that it was truly mysterious to them, that ultimately they were pushing into something truly unknown that they didn't have the empirical tools to gather information about, and so where they pushed into the unknown, they found their own psyche. The unconsciousness fills in the gaps of our ignorance. But this is why the obscure questions of the nature of matter become even more obscure, because the human psyche is, in some ways, an even more mysterious thing. And the so-called knowledge that confronted the alchemists was really more akin to the world of dreams or hallucinations. And when we get to the second part of this episode, two-part episode, we'll consider Jung's use of alchemy in interpreting dreams. He feels that a great deal of alchemical symbolism comes forward in dreams, and that by studying the alchemical symbolism, one can learn something about the language of the unconsciousness, the secret language, as Jung calls it, that does not conceal exactly, but it gives signs to us that are, to the rational mind, entirely incomprehensible at first glance, but especially when the dreamer is embarked on a work of self-transformation or attempting to create a new center to the self, as Jung puts it. That is when the alchemical symbolism tends to appear. So hopefully you're beginning to see that this is a great challenge in understanding alchemy. The reason why most people who approach the topic very quickly become confused and bewildered and chalk the whole thing up to being pseudoscience. Well, that's just outdated, unimportant information. But that's the reaction that the alchemists who wrote these texts wanted you to have. You are not the intended audience. They wrote these texts as hermetic texts, intending to speak to an esoteric audience. This is an esoteric form of science. And so now, in modern times, the general public goes about with this understanding, the alchemists were fools. They thought they could turn lead into gold, right? But now we can already see how that's incorrect. They weren't trying to turn ordinary lead into ordinary gold. They were referring to something else, to the extent that gold was the object of the great work. It was philosophical gold, which might have a different meaning. All sorts of things are cloaked in symbolism and allegory. And furthermore, that wasn't always the end of the work. They also sought after the philosopher's stone, which was said to be various things or have various properties according to, different alchemists said different things about it. But in any case, I suppose I'm just saying the reason why these misperceptions exist is largely because of the alchemists themselves. All of this information is jumbled together and communicated in these religious allegories and symbols that you're not meant to understand. But as we also mentioned, the alchemists invented a great deal of practical techniques and tools and processes that eventually yielded up modern chemistry. And so they were actually doing something. It wasn't just like that it was a purely spiritual metaphor, that they were just sitting there and, meditating over their alembics, right? And one could say the material from which most great psychological insights are drawn should be, we should expect that to include mostly material that was never intended to be of value to psychologists. Because what is of greatest value to psychologists are expressions which unselfconsciously speak from the psyche, right? Because if you're intentionally trying to communicate something about your own psyche, then that will necessarily be a conscious expression, which will come from what? It'll come from your dissimulating ego. Real psychological insights often come from studying expressions which are not intended to be about one's psyche, but end up revealing something about the psyche unconsciously. And, alchemy, it's one of those great treasure troves of psychological insight for that very reason. Religion in general is a treasure trove of psychological insight, quite apart from any evaluation of the truth value of religious claims, whether the superstitions and myths of religion actually describe historical events. Think of Nietzsche's work, for instance. One of the most influential aspects of his work is a psychological analysis of the meaning of Christianity, found, for example, in Genealogy of Morals and in The Antichrist. Nietzsche spends almost no time in either of those works. He's not litigating whether the Christ myth is a historical fact. Aside from the miracles, he seems to take it mostly for granted that Jesus lived and taught, right? He's focused on the psychological reality of Christianity, what it is that Christianity did to psychologically compensate those who adopted it. What desire does Christianity represent? Or in what ways does it indicate to us a general thwarting of worldly desires and a compensatory turning of one's eye to spiritual rather than worldly concerns? And so Jung takes a similar approach to alchemy. He recognizes that alchemy, as a practice that blends science and myth with, it's an attempt of the ego consciousness to penetrate into realms of knowledge that it doesn't fully understand. That inevitably represents, in the final analysis, a series of projections. Whatever is in the human unconsciousness and remains there, suppressed by the conscious life, will end up being projected onto the external world as if it was a separate or external phenomenon. And where we will find these projections will be in the places and in the phenomena that we don't understand or fully comprehend. And so Jung's account, to put it in the broadest possible terms, and perhaps more straightforward terms than he makes the argument, a curious thing must have happened to the alchemists. They spent hours in solitude oftentimes with a laser-like meditative focus on their alchemical work, trying to discover the secrets of matter. Perhaps we can bring to our imagination an alchemist standing over his stove, watching as metals dissolve and intermingle within, the pot of the fire cooking them. And we can imagine as he stares and watches these chemical transformations, trying to glean some information about the secrets of matter, we can imagine that his psyche would begin to project his own unconscious contents onto the chemical reactions. And he might begin to believe that the chemical transformation is in fact a representation or an allegory for a spiritual transformation. And Jung would say that in the psychological transference that has occurred from one's inner life to the world of matter and chemical interactions, alchemy becomes a record of that inner life. And that is, first and foremost, its value to us today, not merely as a historical phenomenon, an outdated form of science that admittedly gave rise to a useful modern science. It's something that we can engage with in the modern world in order to gain a greater understanding of ourselves. It actually has utility to us in modern times to study alchemy, not for the purposes of embarking on our own great work, but for understanding, again, the language that alchemy gives us for speaking or understanding the messages of the unconscious or the content of the unconscious. Now, obviously, this can never be an absolute or total understanding. Jung would hold that such a thing is impossible. The majority of psychic life remains unconscious. I mean, if we imagine the unconsciousness as like a vast dark sea, you might imagine a single spotlight, a beam of light shining down into it. And that's sort of like the location of consciousness, right? Consciousness is too small to take in the totality of the unconscious life. So we can never gain a complete understanding of it. But perhaps by learning at least some of the ways that the unconscious attempts to communicate with conscious life, we can better integrate, better recenter ourselves so that the center of our psyche is not that small, lonely consciousness, but the center of the self as such. And we'll get into that more in the second episode of this series. So Jung writes, and this is in the introduction to the basic concepts of alchemy. This is part 3 of the book Psychology and Alchemy that the text we're primarily using to talk about this. Quote, "Alchemy's inner decay had begun when many alchemists deserted their alembics and melting pots and devoted themselves entirely to Hermetic philosophy. It was then that the chemist and the Hermetic philosopher parted company. Chemistry became natural science, whereas Hermetic philosophy lost the empirical ground from under its feet and aspired to bombastic allegories and inane speculations which were kept alive only by memories of a better time. This was a time when the mind of the alchemist was still grappling with the problems of matter, when the exploring consciousness was confronted by the dark void of the unknown, in which figures and laws were dimly perceived and attributed to matter, although they really belonged to the psyche. Everything unknown and empty is filled with psychological projection. It is as if the investigator's own psychic background were mirrored in the darkness. What he sees in matter, or thinks he can see, is chiefly the data of his own unconscious which he has projected into it. In other words, he encounters in matter, as apparently belonging to it, certain qualities and potential meanings of whose psychic nature he is entirely unconscious. This is particularly true of classical alchemy, when empirical science and mystical philosophy were more or less undifferentiated." End quote. Now, many of you have probably heard that maxim, "as above, so below," and maybe you wonder what it means. This statement is attributed to an ancient alchemical text. And figuring out the timelines and the actual authentic sources of many of these texts, it's impossible because authors would adopt pseudonyms and claim they got ideas from texts that were more ancient and present their own books as if they were translations of ancient and obscure authors and so on and so forth. So I'm not going to bother with that kind of chronological account of alchemy in this episode. You could do that on your own time. Rather, what is important to grasp is that as above, so below is the attitude of someone who has not yet separated science from religion, somebody who has not separated physics from metaphysics. And so in this way, the approach to studying nature that we find in the alchemists is not too dissimilar from, say, the approach of the pre-Socratic philosophers. They attempted to give an account of the laws governing the material world and explain the elements that comprise that world. But usually included in that explanation, there's some sort of god or mythical force, whether it's called mind or Aphrodite, whatever the case may be. And that distinction, it simply hadn't been made in their thought yet. And the further back in history that we proceed, the more unified our scientific thought and religious thought. It's all part of the same activity, which might be called, in the broadest sense, the attempt to discover the truth, right? That's why they're called simply philosophers. The nomenclature the alchemists used for themselves in classical times was simply philosophers. They're simply natural philosophers trying to discover the truth. And so they're lovers of wisdom, right? The pursuit of knowledge which is not widely held. Now, before we venture more deeply into the Jungian analysis of alchemical symbolism and its psychological significance, I'd like to speak about what I'll term the correspondence thinking, which is inherent to alchemy and in some ways definitive of alchemical thought, and definitive, it must be said, of superstitious thought in general. And this does tie into the thought of Jung as well. In some sense, it's represented by his idea of synchronicity, which he doesn't really discuss in the text Psychology and Alchemy, but it's important to understand. So let's put ourselves into the mindset of the alchemist. There's no distinction between science and religion, and the world as it appears, the material world, is governed by or reflects a spiritual world. It seems a reasonable proposition, following from this, that the changes and transformations that one perceives in the physical world might reflect an analogous change, an analogous process in the spiritual world. As Jung would caution us, we can't really approach this information with our mechanistic modern mindset, in which cause and effect is what governs the world. If we truly wish to understand, we have to make a series of irrational and quite preposterous conflations. We have to be willing to say that if something is like or alike to something else, akin to, similar to something else, shares a quality with something else, that in some sense it really is that thing. And as we go through this list that I'm going to read through, I think many of you will be surprised to learn that these correspondences, this type of thinking, this endures to this very day within our culture, and it'll appear in surprising places. Even though we don't think this way anymore, those associations still exist. Now, in alchemy, the three most important substances are mercury, sulfur, and salt. Mercury is also among the 7 most important metals to the alchemists, which were arranged in a sort of hierarchy or progression of stages. But sulfur and salt, you can think immediately of sulfur being associated with hellfire and the devil, salt, the salt of the earth, things like that. And so you have these two substances that are in a way like stand for good and evil, to put it in very, 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 very vulgar terms. The alchemists wouldn't have necessarily seen it that way. But it's interesting that we have the symbology from the very beginning of the sort of the 3 most basic substances that you're going to be using, that are the foundation of all of their work. You have sulfur on the one hand, you have salt on the other, and then in the middle is mercury, quicksilver, which is this changeable sort of fluidic metal. It's very like contradictory and paradoxical metal, which is associated with the god Mercury. And we'll get into that as we talk about sort of those 7 important alchemical metals. But right here at the beginning, there's this red thread running through alchemy of the unification of opposites. And that's what very much intrigues Jung about alchemical thought from the beginning, that it's this sort of compensatory movement to deal with the ways in which the conscious life has drawn these opposing boundaries and then attempted to exclude things from the psyche, right? The ways we talked about before, the feminine being excluded from the image of the divine, the shadow being excluded from the divine figure. Well, here we have sulfur, which sort of has those implications of the demonic, right? Or that which is low, that which comes out of the earth and has like a foul stench to it and everything like that. So sort of, if not purely demonic, it's low, it's base. And then salt, which is, used as a metaphor by Christ for the sort of the inner quality of, it's like, it's one of the most valuable substances. It's been used as currency for hundreds, thousands of years, and never loses its flavor. For instance, it might be seen as a sort of a miraculous or uncanny thing from the ancient mind. So it's a thing of value, and it's a thing that, again, was used as a metaphor for being people that were within sort of Christ's kingdom, that ye are the salt of the earth. And then Mercury is sort of in between, again, standing for the god Mercurius, who is like an intercessory deity that goes between heaven and earth. It's a messenger between the gods and the underworld, who goes down to heaven or down to hell and all the way up to heaven, and so on and so forth. And so now let's talk about the 7 alchemical metals. And they are arranged in a progression leading from lead eventually to gold. But again, that's another sort of mistake in the modern mind. Lead never turns straight into gold. The alchemists never claimed that. And furthermore, this shouldn't be taken literally. These 7 metals could represent more than the physical substance of lead or gold, because they're not speaking of the common lead or the common gold, but alchemical gold or philosophical gold. And then again, you have to put yourself into this correspondence thinking, where when they're talking about something calling it gold, it may be something that shares some sort of quality with gold. And so these are just more complications. But nevertheless, what are these 7 metals that the alchemists talked about? In order, we have lead, tin, bronze, iron, mercury, silver, and gold. Now that sequence may seem arbitrary, but there is a logic to this progression. Each one of these metals indicates a series of correspondences, and the most important of these correspondences are the personages of classical deities. So, for example, we'll look at lead first, which symbolizes the god Saturn, or it signifies Saturn. Saturn is an agricultural deity. He is also a deity of decay, so he's a god of contradictions in that sense. Saturnalia, his holiday, was a time of role reversal, and Saturn has always had that element of his character. But in a way, I wouldn't just call him a god of contradictions. He sort of represents that wisdom that's encapsulated in Chinese yin-yang thought, that when one opposite on a binary goes to the extreme, that extreme contains the seeds of the opposite, or it contains the seeds of its undoing. The resurgence of the opposite pole will happen precisely at the moment when the one pole has reached its extreme, right? So it's the moment when summer ends and autumn arrives and the period of leaves falling, the onset of decay. That's when we have a great fall harvest, right? And it's only in decay and composting and feeding of worms and detritus feeders and so on that we get fertile soil. And so lead symbolizes the lowest stage of the alchemical work, but it also has a feeling associated with it as well. There's a sort of emotional palette, particularly melancholy. And we might think about why they would make such an association, but it's the heaviest element. And we might say that Saturn, lead, it sort of symbolizes the most material of all the material elements in alchemy. It's the most bound to the earth. It's the heaviest. It is the most base, right? And there's also a color association. It's typically black is sort of the color that's associated with lead, which for obvious reasons. Now, as we go through the other metals in this sequence, each of them has all of these correspondences. So the next metal, tin, is associated with Jupiter and with the color blue. It's associated with an emotional state of exuberance or good humor. And it's said to represent a process of ennobling. And we might ask why. Well, tin, on the other hand, is the lightest of substances. It's also a key ingredient in making bronze, along with copper. So we can see how the ancient mind might see tin as this ennobling element because it was incredibly rare. It only came from a few places, I believe, like Afghanistan, and I think they had tin mines in Britain. Don't quote me on that. But, you could see that tin was this element that took copper and ennobled it into bronze. It makes it bronze, which is, for a long time, the metal that you would use for the weapons and armors of warriors, of noble warriors, right? And bronze is the next element in the sequence, which is associated with Venus. Its color is green. And you might ask, well, why would bronze's color be green? But if you've seen a very old bronze statue, what color does it turn? I mean, the Statue of Liberty is green, but it wasn't green when it was first constructed, and that's because of a process known as verdigris. And so Venus, as a goddess, is associated with bronze. Venus is obviously associated with love. And again, some of these associations or correspondences may not be as obvious to us, but again, it might be because bronze is it's created within a union. We might say the marriage coming together, the attraction of copper and tin, right? And so perhaps that's why there's some of those associations there. Next, there is iron, which is associated with Mars, and thus with martial qualities and with those sorts of states of mind, such as anger or frenzy. That's sort of the emotional palette. And, we can easily bridge that very quickly with the understanding that iron is the element that, after bronze, is what people use to make weapons of war. And it's paired with the color red. And if you've seen iron oxide, you would know why it has a red color. Now, following this is Mercury, and that's, again, one of the most important metals associated with the god Mercury, or Hermes, the messenger of the gods. And as we've said, we've already kind of talked about Mercury to some extent, but it's a liquid metal. It represents fluidity, just as Mercury is the intercessor between the material world and the divine. So it's sort of in this in-between space. And Jung sees the god Mercury as associated with various cultural symbols such as the Fool, or even in popular works of fiction, Mephisto in Faust, Jung would say is a mercurial type of character. Mercury is often associated with the intellect itself, and so if it has an emotional palette, it's perhaps curiosity, or as Nietzsche would say, the will to truth. Now, to consider the final two elements, we'll sort of look at them together, silver and gold, which are associated with the moon and sun, respectively, and with the colors, silver and gold, that are named for these elements. And these are the final two stages of the alchemical work, usually. Silver is a pure metal. It's not as brilliant or as valuable as gold. In that way, we could say silver is sort of like the moon. The moon reflects the light of the sun, but it's not itself the sun in its full golden brilliance, right? Now, in classical alchemy, the moon might have been associated with Diana or another moon goddess. The sun before might stand for Apollo or be represented by him in the pagan world. But in the Christian world, it's the moon is obviously, and silver would be associated with Mary, the Virgin Mother. And the moon is said to be a Marian symbol because Mary reflects the light of her sun, very on-the-nose metaphor. So, we might say the moon, it's purifying, it's reflective. It's reflective, but it's not creative, right? Whereas the gold is associated with Christ or the Godhead. This is the symbol for the creative, active power found at the end of the magnum opus, and obviously associated with the sun, which is the source of all life and warmth in the world. Now, earlier I suggested that you might recognize this sequence or this 7 sets of correspondences. And, the first thing I would ask is, have you wondered how we selected the gods to name the planets in our solar system? Why do we have the planets Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune? Now, granted, Neptune wasn't on the list I just read, but we didn't discover that planet until much more recently, and it was named much more recently. But, in fact, to the ancient mind, the planet Venus, right, the star Venus, as they called it, that was the goddess Venus. Right? To the Romans, when you looked up in the sky, you see Venus. That is Venus, the goddess. And so Venus, who is also bronze, who is also love, is also a star in the night sky, right? These planets were so named because these deities had important alchemical and astrological symbolism. And so when you were talking about one of these phenomena, right, like an emotional state or a metal or a star in the sky or a deity, you're also talking about everything else associated with it. And that's very strange, again, to our minds, which are based on sort of making distinctions and establishing these chains of like cause and effect in relationships, whereas the ancient mind is more about making conflations and blurring things together. And there's something else. Think about the 7 days of the week. For one, why do we have 7? Well, we get the 7-day week from the Romans, and the Romans named their days of the week after these 7 deities, which are also heavenly bodies, which is to say stars and planets. And when the Germanic peoples adopted the Roman 7-day week, they attempted to substitute their own deities or their own terms for the Roman equivalent deities. They inserted their own gods that they thought to be an equivalent. So Monday is quite literally Moon Day. Tuesday is named for Tu, which is that's spelled Tiw. That's a Teutonic war god associated with Mars. Wednesday is Woden's Day. That's why it has that strange spelling that we pronounce mostly silently. And Wotan was associated with Mercury. And that's because Woden is a god who walks among men. He's a god who appears in the guise of a stranger who gives wisdom to mortals. So he's that intercessory type figure. Thursday is the day of thunder, named for Thunor. You probably know him by his Norse name, Thor, whom the Germanic pagans would have substituted for Jupiter. They're both thunder gods, after all. And Friday is Frigga's day, or Freya's day, if we were to again use the Norse goddess, and Frigga stands in for Venus. Saturday, you can probably figure that one out because the Germans didn't change the name as they had no equivalent to the god Saturn. And finally, Sunday, the day of the sun, pretty straightforward on the last one. And so that's just one of the things that Jung means, by the way, when he speaks of the immense cultural impact of alchemy. These series of correspondences, which are irrational, yes, and unscientific, yes, they are nevertheless formative on the European mind. And whenever there was a sequence of 7, right, you can see that this formula is applied again and again of this sequence. And it's quite amazing to me that people will, every week will invoke Woden or Saturn without even knowing it, and simply speaking the days of the week. That ancient sequence of 7 gods, or 7 metals, 7 heavenly bodies, 7 stages of the spiritual work, and so on, that still exists in our culture in a way that's unconscious to most of us, just in the language and the names that we use. So again, while the idea of literally transforming lead into gold is clearly chemically impossible, we've already hinted at very real correspondences here insofar as that a lot of this alchemical symbolism could be based on, right? That tin and copper make bronze. Bronze becomes a symbol of union, right? So that metallurgical relationship of needing tin to turn copper into bronze from the perspective of a person from ancient times attempting to grasp these laws of the material world, that must have been seen as the discovery of transforming one type of matter into another. And that led them to the supposition that other transformations were possible. And so, again, it's also very ignorant and dismissive, just the way that people will sort of discount it as pseudoscience. It's not like we hadn't figured out how to turn metals into other metals before, right? How to make new substances from combining old ones. The idea that, well, if that's the case in principle, they didn't know anything about atomic theory, then why couldn't you turn lead into gold? Even though, again, that's not really the goal of the work, but it's not such a preposterous notion given their lack of information. They had to discover that that wasn't possible. But in any case, the other, another theory that I've heard about alchemy that I'll bring up just as sort of an aside, gold never loses its luster, right? So perhaps one interpretation of the chemical side of the alchemical work, was an attempt to find a substance that could make other elements, quote unquote, like gold, make it possess the quality of gold by effectively polishing them, returning them to an untarnished state, the way that gold always is. So it's not even entirely clear that the sequence indicates, it's not lead literally turns into tin and then tin literally turns into bronze. Rather, learning something about the chemical composition of each metal might provide you with a series of insights that eventually reveals to you how to make, quote-unquote, lesser metals alike to gold, make them take on an aspect of gold. And from your perspective, that might be the same as making them gold, right? Because of the correspondence thinking. So there's many ways to interpret what the alchemists were doing. And by the way, not all of them were doing the same thing. Not all of them were concerned with the same things. And many of their discoveries, yes, may have been accidental. They may have been mere side effects of attempting to do things that were actually impossible. But the fact remains, essentially they were trying to understand material transformations, and they didn't know enough about how matter works to understand the actual basis of material transformation, so they projected a symbolical language of spiritual transformation onto it, and this symbolical language of spiritual transformation, quite apart from whatever chemical discoveries it may have led to, is fascinating for Jung precisely because of the fact that it is a projection. And so Jung writes, quote, "The alchemist did not practice his art because he believed, on theoretical grounds, in correspondence. The point is that he had a theory of correspondence because he experienced the presence of pre-existing ideas in physical matter. I mean by this that while working on his chemical experiments, the operator had certain psychic experiences which appeared to him as the particular behavior of the chemical process. Since it was a question of projection, he was naturally unconscious of the fact that the experience had nothing to do with matter itself, that is, with matter as we know it today. He experienced his projection as a property of matter, but what he was really experiencing was his own unconscious." End quote. So again, all of this correspondence theory, Jung points out, is very important. He did not have a consciously articulated theoretical basis for correspondence thinking, as we might have for our causal thinking, for example. If anything, Jung attributes the correspondence thinking, the grip that it had in the alchemical mind, to precisely the fact that he experienced correspondences because he was projecting the entire time. But more to the point, the theme that we're pushing into the unknown with the consciousness, and that unknown necessarily becomes the unconscious. Now, there is a final aspect of alchemy that I want to clarify before we continue, and these are the 3 or sometimes 4 stages of the great work. And here I think we'll see very clearly that what ostensibly describes a chemical process can be seen as an allegory for a transformation that occurs in psychic life. The first stage is called the nigredo, the blackening, and this is correlated with the long night of the soul, a period of spiritual development that many traditions describe as a necessary part of one's spiritual progression. And it comes with a feeling of, solitude and alienation. In clinical terms, maybe depression, even though many spiritual types will have an issue with that. But you sort of feel, when you embark on a path of spiritual or psychological development, you eventually fall into a feeling of detachment from the rest of the world. You begin to cultivate this all-encompassing doubt, and by feeling that you've tapped into these questions or even spiritual truths that other people don't have experience with or don't seem to see, it sort of comes with a feeling of loneliness or even of separation from the divine. The next phase in alchemy, and so by the way, the nigredo, again, to the alchemists, they didn't think they were describing the black night of the soul, right? They thought they were describing the beginning of the great work, which is sort of like a dissolution, a dissolving, a putrefaction, right? That's what they called it, putrefactio. That's what's going on during the nigredo. But again, we have to see the correspondence here and how it's used. So the next stage is the albedo, which is a whitening, and that's seen as like a process of purification. And again, this is a literal chemical thing that they were attempting to describe, but there's religious symbolism here, and it's fairly straightforward. I mean, I think it's sort of contained in the aphorism that you're ready for the greatest transformation upon the death of what you were before, right? In Buddhist terms, you're only ready to seek enlightenment when your ego's been crushed. And a Christian might say that you have to lose your pride before calling on the grace of God, something like that. The albedo is not the work's completion, but it could be seen as like the light at the end of the tunnel. It says, or like a guiding star in the darkness. And sometimes the alchemist said it was preceded by what was called the peacock's tail, a profusion of different colors appearing in the work. And finally, rubedo, a reddening, and that's the work's completion. It's wholeness, and this is associated with the philosopher's gold. The imagery surrounding it is sort of like the reddening of the dawn, the bursting into being of the full sunlight. We might think in Nietzschean terms, becoming the creative child, or think of the words of Jesus, changing to become once again like a little child in order to enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, we're going over a lot of the religious symbolism and allegory that's used for this, but the rubedo was said to be the final stage of an actual physical chemical work. Now, I mentioned there are sometimes 4 stages. In some texts after the whitening stage, the alchemists wrote of xanthosis, a yellowing, but this stage of the work was eventually dropped in later times. And, part of why I thought it was important to bring this up, the sort of the 3 or 4 stage sequence. Jung did quite a bit of writing about numerology, and there's some writing about numerology in this very book, Psychology and Alchemy. And it's a bit difficult to explain, but Jung would say the number 3 or the trinity, the triangle, is sort of like an incomplete completeness, that the psyche tends to waver between 3 and 4 as sort of the end of the self-transformation process, just as it also wavers between 7 and 8. So there were 7 alchemical stages. In some earlier texts, there's 8 alchemical stages. So why would this be? Maybe this will take us too far afield into real deep esotericism, but for example, in the Kabbalistic tree of life, right? You have this idea that, trying to comprehend the way that all creation unfolded, right? That first, or the way that God's nature unfolded. We can imagine if you had a completely monistic universe, that's just oneness, right? That would be sort of the significance of one, would be a monism. But it's precisely at the moment when you recognize the existence of that oneness, that you recognize the existence of being, when that being becomes known to itself. We might imagine again in Kabbalistic philosophy, perhaps in the mind of God, that you gain a corresponding conception of non-being. And so we might say that as a consequence of conceiving of one, you have to conceive of two, because to conceive of being, you have to conceive of non-being. And then once you've conceived of both being and non-being, you have this dualism The Trinity is sort of like the concept of a third unifying thing, the mediation between being and non-being. And that would seem to be sort of like completion, right? But Jung will say that a quaternity is really what the mind is aimed at. And this was often symbolized by attempting to square the circle, was one of the sort of alchemical language or symbolism. And Jung would say that this is part of what is achieved with the Christian Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. With the Assumption of Virgin Mary, she sort of forms a quaternity, and that's true completeness. It's a wholeness. And that's because, in the words of Maria Prophetissa, she says, quote, "One becomes two becomes three, and out of the third becomes the one as fourth," end quote. And so the fourth is a new one, if that makes sense. It's not just the third, which is the mediation between being and non-being, but we might say the fourth is the wholeness, the completeness of the entirety, right? And this is all very sort of symbolical and abstract and might, again, take us too far afield. But it was important enough that Jung at least mentions it. And the numerological significance, again, just like all of these correspondences between planets and gods and metals and emotional states, it's not very rational. But understanding what the cultural and spiritual associations are with these numbers is very helpful for just the sake of interpretation, right? So, for example, in China, the number 5 is sort of like the number of mankind, right? You might think the human being has 5 extremities. It's sort of like a worldly number because there's the 5 elements that make up all the material in the world, so that they have those associations with the number 5, right? And so learning these things, and some of them are cross-cultural as well. We find, for example, that same sort of dialectic about duality and non-being versus being, and then a third thing that unifies them, that also occurs in the East. So in any case, that's the significance of like the 3 or 4 stage sequence, and Jung points out the mind is always sort of like wavering between these two numbers. But in any case, these Negredo, Albedo, and Rubedo, it sort of describes a process, and presumably an actual chemical process. But, just to walk through it in the case of Negredo, like a putrefaction or dissolution, which is a necessary step before coagulation and purification. But it's a mistake to, I think, correlate any given phase of the work with like a particular chemical transformation. Because, again, the alchemists said it's not that they didn't tell us what these things were associated with, it's that they all made different associations. They said too many things, and so it's too many contradictory things. So it's almost impossible to say that there was any consensus on what each phase of the work meant. But we can say, at the very least, that there's a clear correspondence or correlation between this beginning, which is dark and dissolute and depressing. That's very, we might say, lead-coated. And then at the end, this burst of red and gold like the sun, very clearly gold-coated, right? And so yet again, even within these 3 or 4 stages of the alchemical work that don't even they're referencing processes, they're not talking about physical substances, we can see how, well, the Negredo, in a way, this black night of the soul is like lead. And we start there, that's the beginning of the great work, and then we get to gold. But that's not describing turning lead, the substance, into gold. It's describing a process of dissolution and putrefaction, yielding up a miraculous substance with great creative power, right? So it's, so disentangling all this is very difficult. And we're going to look at another quote from Jung on this. Quote, "The basis of alchemy is the work, opus. Part of this work is practical, the operatio itself, which is thought of as a series of experiments with chemical substances. In my opinion, it is quite hopeless to try and establish any kind of order in the infinite chaos of substances and procedures. Seldom do we even get an approximate idea of how the work was done, what materials were used, and what results were achieved. The reader usually finds himself in the most impenetrable darkness when it comes to the names of these substances. They could mean almost anything. And it is precisely the most commonly used substances, like quicksilver, salt, and sulfur, whose alchemical meaning is one of the secrets of the work. Moreover, one must not imagine for a moment that the alchemists always understood one another. They themselves complain about the obscurity of the texts and occasionally betray their inability to understand even their own symbols and symbolic figures." End quote. So if you're confused, that's because it's confusing. In many ways, the alchemists were confused too, and they attempted to confuse all of us as well. And so sort of like parsing out, is the great work, should we look at it as going through these 7 or 8, transformations into different kinds of substances? Should we look at these 3 or 4 stages of chemical processes? Do they ultimately overlap and describe the same thing? And I think Jung would say, don't try and figure that out. Don't try and make a synthesis out of all of this information. You should look at it again. It's the way that Jung talks about this is really only incidental to the way he describes alchemy, but I think it's very helpful to look at it as a lexicon or a language of the unconscious, the way that he's describing it. And you might just look at it as like everyone sort of had their own dialect, and they don't necessarily say the same thing, but there's overlap, there's correspondence, familial resemblance between different symbols and sets of symbols. And we're dealing with a phenomenon where the symbol, the signifier, is never revealed straightforwardly. Or, to speak more accurately, there's just no universal agreement on what the signifiers actually signify. Sometimes the alchemists themselves don't know, which is what we would expect if they were getting the symbols they were using from their unconscious content. They wouldn't know what it means. And so, the attempt to parse out what the alchemists were doing in chemical terms is a fool's errand from Jung's point of view. Whatever chemical processes any given alchemist might have suggested might be represented by the transition from nigredo to albedo, that's unimportant. The important thing is that the progression that they often had recourse to use as their language for talking about alchemy. Again, this tells us about their own projections. And so Jung writes, quote, "Although the alchemist was interested in the chemical part of the work, he also used it to devise a nomenclature for the psychic transformations that really fascinated him. Every original alchemist built himself, as it were, a more or less individual edifice of ideas, consisting of the dicta of the philosophers and of the miscellaneous analogies to the fundamental concepts of alchemy." End quote. The alchemists, they all refer back to past concepts in the works of other alchemists, and the same sort of the same collection of fundamental concepts which overlap and they might not all use exactly the same lexicon, but there's a familiar set of terms and ideas, right? The 7 philosophical metals, the 3 or 4 stages, and then as well as things like the Prima Materia and the lapis philosophorum, or the philosopher's stone, or the Prima Materia is the first material, the primordial material. That's the starting material that you use when you embark upon the great work. But even what they say about the Prima Materia, the identity of the Prima Materia, the initial starting material you have to use to begin the great work, is itself a secret. And I guess what I'm trying to get across is, if anyone's saying, well, what is the secret? Can we ever find out what it is? It's no, there is no one answer to that, because what they were talking about is unanchored to anything that was empirical, right? So whatever the secret was different for every single alchemist. He came to his own different understanding of it. So I want to return to the image now that we've kind of talked about basic concepts of alchemy. I want to return to that, what I asked you all to imagine earlier in the episode, of how these set of stages came about, right? Remember, as Jung constantly reminds us, it's of dire importance to understand that to the alchemists, the important thing was the chemical work, right? To us, it's not, but to them it was. So we can imagine the alchemist standing over his melting pot, and he's watching all these substances melding together and dissolving. Perhaps we could imagine it turning into a dark, black, thick, and viscous substance, and bubbling and breaking up. And the alchemist stands there in this sort of meditative state. He's open to receiving insight, which he believes will come to him from God as a result of studying these chemical reactions. Again, very strange idea from our perspective. And then perhaps he sees something like a light, bright sheen upon the surface, perhaps an eruption of many colors. They called that the peacock's tail. And then via heat or whatever process, his concoction becomes quote-unquote purified, perhaps a change of its traits or coloration or something. And so we can see how you could analogize from that process, that beginning from nigredo, that sort of dissolution process, we can imagine seeing the dark night of the soul in that, and then seeing how, like, you become tempered by the fire until you're purified, and that's seeing an analogy there, right? And Jung includes a potential example of this in the text. This is from a treatise from the early 1700s, which is translated from Ethiopian into Latin and then into German, and now here into English. But this text is by no means ancient, and as Jung says in a footnote, it contains the traits of alchemy's decadent period, as he calls it, right? The decadent meaning it's when the esotericism splits off from the chemistry. But nevertheless, it seems to continue in the alchemical tradition of a sort of a spiritual narrative projected onto a chemical reaction. And so I wanted to quote from this because it's an example of how this kind of projection might work. Quote, "Take of common rainwater a good quantity, at least 10 quarts. Preserve it well sealed in glass vessels for at least 10 days. Then it will deposit matter and feces on the bottom. Pour off the clear liquid and place it in a wooden vessel that is fashioned round like a ball. Cut it through the middle and fill the vessel a third full, and set it in the sun about midday in a secret or secluded spot. When this has been done, take a drop of the consecrated red wine and let it fall into the water, and you will instantly perceive a fog and thick darkness on top of the water, such as also was at the first creation. Then put in 2 drops, and you will see the light coming forth from the darkness, whereupon little by little put in every of each quarter hour, first 3, then 4, then 5, then 6 drops, and then no more, and you will see with your own eyes, one thing after another appearing by and by on top of the water, how God created all things in 6 days, and how it all came to pass, and such secrets as are not to be spoken aloud. And I also have not power to reveal. Fall on your knees before you undertake this operation. Let your eyes judge of it, for thus was the world created. Let all stand as it is, and in half an hour after it began, it will disappear." End quote. So, in this case, we have a description of a chemical process that it doesn't involve metallurgy at all, and it doesn't involve a final product of the work. There's no philosopher's stone at the end here. In fact, the author promises that it will disappear. But what he says is, I'm paraphrasing here. You'll understand all the things that Moses has written about the creation of the world. You'll understand all sorts of spiritual secrets that have been hidden from you. You'll know the meaning of paradise and the resurrection and so on. And so this is why Jung says it already bears the mark of the decadent period of alchemy as a very late work, because the old alchemists were actually searching for a philosopher's stone, or in whatever form they conceived of it. There really was a physical process and a physical result that they were seeking. But we have to hold in our minds 2 paradoxical facts: that this chemical knowledge is absolutely not the thing of significance to us, but also that the psychological knowledge is only of significance if they were totally absorbed in the work with the mindset that it was indeed a chemical process. And so this text is already from a period that's sort of branched off into consciously treating alchemy as a spiritual work with spiritual fruits. That's why Jung calls it decadent. So they're not totally focused on the chemical. They're literally saying the chemical is just an analogy for something that God will reveal to you about the nature of creation. But, if we set all that aside, what does the author describe? He describes a darkening of the waters, a fog washing over everything, the darkness before God said, "Let there be light," and then the light breaking, and then the revelation of spiritual knowledge, and a promise that it will lead the alchemist to understand wholeness, in the same sense that we will all have wholeness upon receiving a new perfected, resurrected body in heaven. It will lead him to understanding creation, right? And so we can see that negredo, albedo, rubedo pattern, even in this alchemical text that is very late and doesn't, fully describe the alchemical work as it was classically understood. But it's just a great example. I wanted to use this text, even though it's a bad example of classical alchemy. It's a great example of explicitly telling us how the author was projecting their spiritual ideas onto this chemical reaction that they were witnessing in front of them, that they didn't fully understand. Now, we should talk about the philosopher's stone, about the actual goal of classical alchemy, the lapis philosophorum. The stone's called by many names. Sometimes it's actually said to be a liquid in addition to being a stone. And given that this is a chemical process, that shouldn't be too surprising. Something could be at one time a solid and another a liquid. But again, saying what the Philosopher's Stone definitively is, like with everything else, would be impossible. Different alchemists at different times had varying conceptions of what it was and what the goal of the work was. Sometimes the goal of the work was said to be immortality. Sometimes it was the substance that makes other elements like gold. Again, in the most reductive and cynical possible analysis, maybe it was a mere polish or something of the sort. But sometimes it's compared with, like, the Holy Grail. And basically, however the lapis was discussed, we can sort of grasp that the underlying desire beneath this concept was the dream of discovering the wisdom of how to perfectly manipulate matter in any way that one wishes. To be able to convert matter the way the replicator does in Star Trek, And if one could do this, if one possessed the knowledge to make any transformation of matter that one desires, then in theory, yes, following from that, one could become immortal. One could create unlimited gold. Vulgar gold, right? But it's precisely because the alchemists thought that only God could make the knowledge available to the wise, right? Only to those who would use it for noble purposes, for pious purposes. Their real goal could never be personal immortality or riches or worldly ambition, even if they thought that the knowledge of how to do so might be granted to them by alchemy. That could never be their actual goal. And so to return to the psychological interpretation, Jung would argue the real holy grail that the alchemist was searching for was psychological wholeness, that the stone is a symbol for the integration of the self. And that's why in the Christian era, even though it is indicated by multiple symbols, many of the symbols are themselves associated with Christ and with the Holy Grail and so on. And so to the extent that the alchemists succeeded, the success could only really be of a spiritual nature, which is to say a psychological nature. And so the Philosopher's Stone has to sort of remain, for Jung, it can never be anything more than a symbol for this wholeness or this completion. And Jung is fairly certain they never achieved anything in terms of actually creating the lapis philosophorum. And this is why Hermeticism branches off from alchemy, and it loses its potency by becoming self-consciously symbolic. Even though Jung would say, the symbolism was really where it's at, it was in the fact that it was unself-conscious symbolism. Now, I'm going to return to the introduction of Psychology and Alchemy, where there's an interesting passage on this. And in this section, Jung is talking about the psychological imbalances within Christianity that we mentioned at the beginning of the episode and the way that alchemy compensates for it. Particularly the Christian overemphasis on the masculine to the exclusion of the divine feminine. And the masculine in Christianity is associated with the spirit. God is a spirit. Christ, the Son of God in human form, as I argued in the past, is relatively inhuman character, right? He has no worldly lust or material desires. And the material world, meanwhile, is associated with the feminine. It's Eve who seduces Adam to sin, right? But even in terms of the way the Catholic Church talks about the relationship between Christ and his church, right? Christ is the bridegroom and the church is the bride, right? The church is referred to as feminine because it's the earthly manifestation of Christianity. The Christianity in the world is feminine, right? Eternally awaiting the return of the masculine spirit to come claim his church and set the world aright. And so the feminine is chthonic. It's associated with earth and the deep and the lower, right? And this is just as true in Chinese thought as in Western thought, and it's just as true going back into Greek philosophy, which is pre-Christian. But these associations of the masculine with the spirit and the feminine with the worldly really attain their apogee in Christianity. And so Jung writes, and I'm reading in an abridged form, quote, "The historical shift in the world's consciousness towards the masculine is compensated at first by the chthonic femininity of the unconscious. Were the unconscious merely complementary, this shift of consciousness would have been accompanied by the production of a mother and daughter, for which the necessary material lay ready to hand in the myth of Demeter and Persephone. But as alchemy shows, the unconscious chose rather the Kybele Attis type in the form of the Prima Materia and the Filius Macrocosmi, thus proving that it is not complementary but compensatory. This goes to show that the unconscious does not simply act contrary to the conscious mind, but modifies it, more in a manner of an opponent or a partner. The son does not call up a daughter as a complementary image from the depths of the, quote, chthonic unconscious. it calls up another sun. Not the antithesis of Christ, but rather his chthonic counterpart. Not a divine man, but a fabulous being conforming to the nature of the primordial mother. This is the drama that was played out in the obscurities of alchemy. It is superfluous to remark that these two suns were never united, except perhaps in the mind and innermost experience of a few particularly gifted alchemists. But it is not very difficult to see the purpose of this drama. In the incarnation, it looked as though the masculine principle of the father world were approximating to the feminine principle of the mother world, with the result that the latter felt impelled to approximate in turn to the father world. What it evidently amounted to was an attempt to bridge the gulf separating the two worlds as compensation for the open conflict between them. End quote. It's a lot to disentangle in that passage. So let's clarify a couple things first. So again, the Prima Materia of the alchemists is their term for the primordial form of matter, and it's another alchemical secret. And again, if you look at it, trying to unriddle it as a proto-scientific claim, it'll simply be frustrating because they make all sorts of claims about what the Prima Materia is. But if we look at it from Jung's perspective, he would say, how do the alchemists discuss the Prima Materia? What symbolism do they use, even though it's various different contradictory things? It is primarily the symbolism of water and earth and the divine feminine. And what of the Filius Macrocosmi, that's one of the names for the philosopher's stone, which literally means the cosmic sun, right? That's one of the names they called the fruit of the great work was the cosmic sun. And in order to begin the great work of creating the philosopher's stone, one had to discover the Prima Materia. That's a common theme in alchemical texts. And then it produces this cosmic sun, which was said to be like fire or ether or air, these sort of, to be paradoxically a water that can warm or burn or produce fire. Those are some of the contradictions that they say. So it's like a fire born out of the water, or we might say a masculine image born out of the chthonic feminine. So Jung would say the significance here is that alchemy produces a psychodrama in which the chemical processes are represented by a divine mother giving rise to a son, the solver and separator, right? The completion of the project, the redemption, the elevation of the alchemist's work. And this provides us with a fascinating insight into how the unconscious functions, again, by the way Jung puts it, not complementary but compensatory. In other words, the alchemists don't produce an opposite in the sense of a female mother-daughter pair to match the father-son pair and God and Christ. Or they don't produce an opposite in the sense of like an antichrist. They unify masculine and feminine, but they repeat the transformation that is told of in the spiritual narrative, the birth of Christ, the Savior of the world from a pure virginal mother, right? That's all repeated in the form of the alchemist finding the Prima Materia and producing a material sun. And thus, we might say, the whole drama plays out in a spiritual form in the Gospels, and it plays out in a material form, and thus a feminine, chthonic form in the quest for the philosopher's stone, if that makes sense. And one might ask, what's the relation of one to the other? But Jung says that would be superfluous to ask. One sun is the conscious story, the consciously articulated gospel story of the Savior as masculine. The other is the unconscious psychological compensation for that purely masculinized spiritual story found in the projections onto like a esoteric chemistry, right? So to the extent that the two suns are united, so to speak, it's that the unity between them is that they are both the symbol for the object of the self's highest desire from Jung's point of view, which is individuation. Both are a symbol for the ideal of the individual, one within the consciously articulated doctrinal understanding of the Christian, but the other is a symbol for the self unconsciously within the dream world created by the alchemist's projections onto his chemical operations. Jung writes of the Prima Materia, quote, "The basis of the opus, the Prima Materia, is one of the most famous secrets of alchemy. This is hardly surprising, since it represents the unknown substance that carries the projection of the autonomous psychic content. It was, of course, impossible to specify such a substance because the projection emanates from the individual and is consequently different in each case. For this reason, it is incorrect to maintain that the alchemists never said what the Prima Materia was. On the contrary, they gave all too many definitions, and so were everlastingly contradicting themselves. For one alchemist, the Prima Materia was quicksilver. For others, it was ore, iron, gold, lead, salt, sulfur, vinegar, water, air, fire, earth, blood, water of life, lapis, poison, spirit, cloud, sky, dew, shadow, sea, mother, moon, dragon, Venus, chaos, microcosm. Ruhlen's lexicon gives no less than 50 synonyms, and a great many more could be added, end quote. So again, part of why I quoted that is just to point out that we run into the same problem about making any sorts of claims about what these refer to in chemical terms, but if we treat it purely as a symbol, we find the predominance of associations there that are chthonic, right? Dark, feminine. So according to many, the Prima Materia is just water. But the other common association is with earth, and it's often said it can be found in everywhere, or it can be found in everything and everywhere, that the Prima Materia contains all substances within it, and furthermore that all substances contain the Prima Materia. And this is how it can often be said that the Prima Materia is a water that contains the secret fire. And it's often associated with chaos, quote, a massa confusa that gives birth to the stone, end quote. We might think of the philosopher Anaxagoras, who put forward the idea of a primordial chaos that contains all types of elements as the fundamental state of being. And further, the Prima Materia is often associated with the negredo, with the first stage of the opus. And so, one of the common associations you might see in an alchemical text might be the Prima Materia is depicted as like a stretch of black good earth from which sprouts a golden shaft of wheat that represents the great work, the philosophical gold, right? You can see how the image of fire that is born out of water is a completely different image from a golden stalk of wheat growing out of black earth. And yet, to the minds of the alchemists, these symbolize the same fundamental thing. And so what's important is, again, understand the correspondence. Get your head into that style of thinking. See the correspondence between the Prima Materia and the feminine. Its associations with water, dew, earth, water of life, the goddess Venus, with Isis and so on, the dragon. The symbolical fact that Jung is pointing to, the Prima Materia is, psychologically speaking, it's unmistakable. It's the great mother. The mother, the divine feminine that's in all things and gives birth to all things, perceived in all her confusing chaos, right? Containing all the world and its many contradictions. And so that points to the alchemical intuition based on their view of the world. The idea that within this primordial water you could miraculously create fire, even to speak in correspondence or symbolical terms. That's the intuition that there is pneuma, that there is spirit infused into all physical things, that the material world is suffused with spirit. And so the philosopher's stone is often described in this way. The alchemists were, quote, looking for the marvelous stone that harbored a pneumatic essence, in order to win from it the substance that penetrates all substances, since it is itself the stone-penetrating spirit, and transforms all base metals into noble ones by a process of coloration. This spirit substance is like quicksilver, which lurks unseen in the ore, and must first be expelled if it is to be recovered in substantia. End quote. So the alchemical opus can be seen psychologically as a quest to find the pneumatic, which is to say the spiritual, in matter, to discover what is the spiritual essence of matter. If this world of matter is actually a world of spirit, either, we might say, in a fallen form in Christianity, or we might say it's created by spirit and it's governed by spirit, right? Then alchemy, like all world religions, is, deep down, the quest to find the spiritual truth behind the phenomenal world. They were driven by the belief that there is animating spirit within matter itself, right? That was simply their understanding of not only the natural world, but also our physiology, that there has to be some sort of, that this isn't a world of dead matter. There's some sort of animating force, by whatever name we want to call it, a spiritual force. That's what makes matter, quote unquote, alive and not inert. And so in the broadest possible terms, alchemists attempted to discern the primordial material, which is ultimately in everything. So what is it? What is the most fundamental form of matter? What is it that makes matter matter? What is the matter that's the most basic form of matter that presumably all different types of matter take part from or are a part of, right? And they wanted to learn then how to transmute that, not for the vulgar purpose of turning lead into gold in a material sense, but how to discover the life force within that primordial material and cause it to reveal itself, show the pneuma within the physical, just as quicksilver sort of has to be liberated to see its true nature, right? It has to be liberated from the ore that it's contained in. And that's perhaps one reason, symbolically speaking, why Mercury or quicksilver is so important to the alchemists. And so this is the real analogy, I would say, between the savior figure and the religious doctrine or narrative, and the significance of the philosopher's stone, the object of the magnum opus, sometimes called as it is the filius macrocosmi, the cosmic sun, that Christ is the revelation of the spiritual within the flesh, and the filius macrocosmi is the revelation of the spirit within matter, within all matter. Now, I mentioned Mercury a second ago. That's part of how they analogize the spirit being suffused into all matter. But to confuse things even more, as we mentioned, Mercury is also associated with the Prima Materia. And Mercury is also associated with the filius macrocosmi, right? So Mercury is sometimes used as a symbol, not only for the beginning of the great work, but also for the end of the great work, and also for the in-between stages of the great work. And, that's because of its associations with Mercurius, the god, because Mercurius, he has a changeable and contradictory nature, right? And that's seen in quicksilver. That's both a metal and a liquid, and so on and so forth. I guess you would say the alchemists used Mercurius the way that Nietzsche used Dionysus, as a sort of like a god that contains both sides of a dichotomy in a way. And the most obvious dichotomy is male and female, and so there's this hermaphroditic imagery that's often used in alchemy, and it's particularly associated with Mercurius and with the Prima Materia. And Jung attempts to explain this. Quote, "When the alchemist speaks of Mercurius, on the face of it he means quicksilver, but inwardly he means the world-creating spirit concealed or imprisoned in matter. The dragon is probably the oldest pictorial symbol in alchemy, of which we have documentary evidence. Time and again the alchemists reiterate that the opus proceeds from the one and leads back to the one, that it is a sort of circle like a dragon biting its own tail. For this reason the opus was often called circulare, or else rota. Mercurius stands at the beginning and the end of the work. He is the prima materia, the caput corvi, the negredo. As dragon he devours himself, and as dragon he dies, to rise again as the lapis. He is the play of colors in the cauda pavonis, and the division into four elements. He is the hermaphrodite that was in the beginning, that splits into the classical brother-sister duality, and is reunited in the conjunctio, to appear once again at the end in the radiant form of the lumen novum, the stone. He is metallic, yet liquid, matter, yet spirit, cold, yet fiery, poison, and yet healing draught, a symbol uniting all opposites." End quote. So on the one hand, it's very clarifying about the role of Mercury. It has a mythological sense to it, because again, Mercury is the go-between, between worlds, right? And so he's the serpent eating his tail. He's at the beginning of the work, and he is there at the end. He is also the primal material. He's also the dissolution of the primal material. He's also the rebirth of it. And yet again, it's somewhat confusing, right? Because if an alchemist is invoking the symbolism of Mercury, which Mercury does he mean? And so you shouldn't be too concerned if you're confused, because not only do they use different conflicting names to indicate something, so they use a million different analogies for the prima materia, then they use the same names, like Mercury, to indicate different things, sometimes to indicate every different thing within the work. So, but one of the things that comes out in that passage is that the Prima Materia is normally chthonic and feminine, but because the Prima Materia is the basis of the great work that creates the cosmic sun, we might say, right? That's where Mercury becomes a hermaphroditic symbol. Right, that it contains the masculine and the feminine. Jung sort of mentions it in passing there, but that whole story is another way of sort of telling the great work. Is sort of you divide the masculine from the feminine. You split their hermaphrodite, and then they become the brother-sister pair, but then they are then reunited in the Mysterium Conjunctionis, the mysterious chemical wedding that finishes off the great work. The alchemists also had the way of talking about this of solva et coagula, dissolve and coagulate, that it was sort of, you had to repeatedly dissolve and coagulate. You repeatedly separate and bring back together different substances to carry on the great work. And so, final thing, I mean, what do the alchemists say about the lapis, the treasure hard to attain, the thing that has to be coaxed out of apparently mundane matter? What are their claims about it? Quote, "The treasure hard to attain, whose presence was suspected in the dark Prima Materia, is symbolized by the alchemists in various ways. Christopher of Paris, for instance, says that the chaos, as Prima Materia, is the work of an all-wise nature. Our understanding, intellectus, aided by the celestial and glowing spirit, must transform this natural work of art, chaos, into the celestial nature of the quintessence, and into the life-giving, vegetabilis essence of heaven. The precious substance is potentially contained in this chaos as a massa confusa of the elements rolled into one, and man must diligently apply his mind to it so that, quote, our heaven may come into reality, ad actum." Johannes Graecius quotes the view that the Prima Materia is the lead, plumbum, of the philosophers, also called the lead of the air, in allusion to the inner opposites. This lead contains the radiant white dove called the salt of the metals. The dove is the chaste, wise, and rich Queen of Sheba, veiled in white, who was willing to give herself to none but King Solomon. According to Basilius Valentinus, the earth, as Prima Materia, is not a dead body, but is inhabited by a spirit that is its life and soul. All created things, minerals included, draw their strength from the earth spirit. This spirit is life, it is nourished by the stars, and it gives nourishment to all the living things it shelters in its womb. Through the spirit received from on high, the earth hatches the minerals in her womb, as the mother her unborn child. This invisible spirit is like the reflection in a mirror, intangible, and yet it is at the same time the root of all the substances necessary to the alchemical process, or arising therefrom, end quote. So, the examples continue on from there. Jung gives a couple more, but I think you can begin to see the pattern here given what we've already discussed. Each alchemist could be describing really any number of things when it comes to the physical chemical processes. But the symbolic language that each uses, even though it's different, right, in every case, there's a kind of overlap. So the idea of, for example, we had the metaphor earlier of fire that is coaxed out of water, and then we have in Johannes Graecius's work the lead of the air, which is also sort of like paradoxical language. And we see that the lead contains a white dove, the salt of the metals. The dove is the Queen of Sheba veiled in white, who's willing to give herself none but King Solomon. The king or the emperor is another symbol often associated with the end of the great work, the appearance of a great king or emperor. And so there's this idea you can see in just taking the work of Johannes Graecius there, the idea of the whitening, the purification of that goes on in the great work coming out of the negredo, right? The white, the albedo coming out of the negredo. And then the ending being, the appearance of this king, this great king, this wise king who was chosen by God. So the spiritual element of being gifted this holy or divine wisdom in order to carry out the great work. And so, we get the sense, without having to know the details of their experiments, that there's this psychological pattern that plays itself out in their writings. The narrative of something radiant and divine, or even intangible, but nevertheless contained within the so-called dark world of matter, something hidden and yet the source of all life. The philosopher's stone, then, the lapis, the treasure hard to attain, is described in equally contradictory terms because it's a psychological symbol for that vital fire of life contained in the mundane, right? And what would it look like if matter were made to yield up that essence? The alchemists always describe it symbolically. Quote, "This fire is the Holy Ghost, who unites Father and Son. He is often represented as a winged old man, i.e. Mercurius, in the form of the god of revelation, who is identical with Hermes Trismegistus, and together with the king and the king's son, forms the alchemical trinity. God wrought this fire in the bowels of the earth, just as he wrought the purging flames of hell, and in this fire God himself glows with divine love. End quote. So next week, we're going to discuss the Philosopher's Stone in greater detail and the things that the alchemists said about the goal of the work. But I'd like to conclude with some remarks on its psychological meaning, as far as we can talk about it here, and Jung's suspicions that the alchemists were at least somewhat aware of this on some level. Again, it's not that they believed, this is actually a pseudoscience, and the only significance is the study of my own mind. Rather, they always emphasized a mental and moral element to the work they were doing. So Jung quotes from the alchemical text, the Rosarium, quote, "Who therefore knows the salt and its solution knows the hidden secret of the wise men of old. Therefore turn your mind upon the salt and think not of other things, for in it alone, i.e. the mind, is the science concealed, and the most excellent and most hidden secret of all ancient philosophers." End quote. And Jung notes that from the Latin, it's very clear that it's meant that the hidden secret is contained in the mind alone, but in later works it was mistranslated as the secret being contained in the salt alone. Jung says this is understandable. After all, mind and salt are etymologically related, but he draws upon, in Latin anyway, but he draws upon other lines in this anonymous text, such as, quote, "The work must be performed with the true, not with the fantastic imagination," end quote. And Jung's comment, quote, "A certain psychological condition is indispensable for the discovery of the miraculous stone," end quote. And thus Jung argues that the passage from the Rosarium can't be a mere misprint, for this sentiment is found in many other alchemical authors. So the alchemists knew, to some extent, that there was an effect of their own mind upon the world of matter. They would not have considered it as the effect of projection, but Jung's assertion is that they were aware that there was a mental aspect. And why would they have this intuition? Well, Jung writes, quote, "As a result of the projection, there is an unconscious identity between the psyche of the alchemist and the arcane substance, i.e., the spirit imprisoned in matter. Just as in the psyche, the multiplicity of sense perceptions produces the unity and simplicity of an idea, so the primal water finally produces fire, i.e. the ethereal substance, not, and this is the decisive point, as a mere analogy, but as the result of the mind's working on matter." End quote. So, not a mere analogy. What does this mean? Well, Jung is saying, while we could consider the thought experiment earlier of the alchemist standing over the stove and coming to some sort of analogy between the psychological process and the chemical process, Jung is saying to him it was not analogous. He didn't perceive the chemical process as an analogy. He perceived the chemical process as actually revealing the spirit imprisoned in matter. And he also believed that he could only gain this revelation by being in a certain state of mind. And so his mind is working on the matter to produce the ethereal substance, to perceive the spirit within matter, which he doesn't experience as an analogy, but as something happening in the material world. But because of the projection, he has some sort of awareness that there is a self-identity between his mind and the magnum opus. Perhaps, on the most basic level, the perception that whatever he discovers in his alchemical work reveals a truth that applies to himself. Because after all, the alchemist too is a material being, which contains spirit within his worldview, right? And so Jung quotes the alchemist Dorn, who writes, quote, "There is in natural things a certain truth which cannot be seen with the outward eye, but is perceived by the mind alone, solamente. And of this, the philosophers have had experience, and have ascertained that its virtue is such as to work miracles. In this truth lies the whole art of freeing the spirit, spiritus, from its fetters, in the same way that, as we have said, the mind, mens, can be freed, i.e. morally, from the body. As faith works miracles in man, so this power, the veritas efficaciae, brings them about in matter. This truth is the highest power, and an impregnable fortress, wherein the stone of the philosophers lies hid." End quote. And so Dorn's claim at the end is that the place where the stone, the treasure hard to attain, is found is where? In truth. And truth is here defined as that which gives us the art of freeing the spirit from its fetters. It is something contained in natural things, but which is perceived by the mind alone. And it's the knowledge, the experience that the philosophers have had in perceiving this truth that is the reason for their wisdom. And so one could get a sense in this passage that Dorn is, perhaps insensibly, leading us to the notion that it isn't as if the stone is a physical thing that the philosophers make. It is a truth. It's something they uncovered about the world. It's an insight. That's the treasure hard to attain. And so, even though the alchemists would have said they derived all their insights from their work with alembics and stoves, and Jung also insists they really believe the work was carried out in a physical sense, there's always the spiritual dimension, both in the mindset needed, and here we see, even in the fruits of the alchemical work. Dorn adds to this passage, quote, "Transform yourselves from dead stones into living philosophical stones," end quote. Jung's comment on this is, quote, "Here he is expressing in the clearest possible way the identity of something in man with something concealed in matter," end quote. And so, even on some partly unconscious level, the alchemists knew they engaged in something that did not merely have implications for their understanding of nature, but for their understanding of themselves and even their own minds. And Jung would say that to the extent that this was dimly perceived, they didn't know just how right they were. The alchemical texts that we have considered in this episode provide us, as I have said, really with an extended lexicon of signifiers for unconscious content, and they certainly didn't know that. But there was that, again, dim perception of what alchemy began to adumbrate to them. We've mostly focused in this episode on laying the groundwork, really, of an explanation of just what alchemy is and what its basic concepts are. And you're probably still massively confused about it, and that makes two of us, right? Or probably much more than that. Hopefully more than one person is listening to this episode. But this is just sort of the basics of alchemy and the basics of how Jung thinks about it. Next time, we're going to dive deeper into the psychological significance, particularly the Lapis-Christ parallel. And then, as I also mentioned, look at Jung's dream study that involves the using this lexicon of alchemical symbolism. So join me then as we continue in our alchemical great work, hopefully move from the obscure to the less obscure for once. Thank you for joining me. Cheers, everybody. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.